Well, greetings everybody, and welcome once again to the Rec Poker Podcast, sponsored by Running Aces Casino and Racetrack. I'm your host, Steve Fredland. Today's topic will be part 5 and our 5th of 5, our final edition, as we discuss Jonathan Little's book, Secrets of Professional Tournament Poker, Volume 1. Today we're going to look at chapters 10 through 15, where Jonathan starts discussing playing with shallower stacks. So once you've moved out of deep stack mode, what are some of the adjustments that you need to make as your stack gets a little bit smaller and ultimately gets super short? Before then, a few announcements. I want to thank our partners, Running Aces as our official sponsor, Next Level Poker, which is our official tour with World Series of Poker bracelet winner Chris Fox Wallace, the Poker is Fun Tour with Minnesota Hall of Famer Mike Schneider, PokerCoaching.com with Jonathan Little, PeakPokerMindset.com with Dr. Tricia Cardner, and Red Chip Poker with James Split Suit Sweeney. And I want to thank those of you who have submitted topic ideas. I'm already starting to put together the next few discussions as we get feedback from our partners. Next week, I anticipate we're going to be talking about how we transition from the middle stages of the tournament as we near the bubble and moving into the final stages. I know I've gotten a number of emails from people saying they really struggle in that area. How do they play that stack? They feel like they punt off too often. So we're going to dig into some of those issues. A couple of just a quick plug here for something else. Most of you know I'm involved with the All In for Africa charity tournaments. I've been to Rwanda 4 times. I'm involved in a nonprofit that's done a ton of work over there. And so we do these charity tournaments, and we have a little bit of a change. We had this huge donation of a Hawaiian trip, and we've decided to make that into another tournament. So for those of you in Minnesota, apologies to those of you not in Minnesota, this will be pretty quick, but we're still having All In for Africa 7, Saturday morning, October 28th, 10 a.m. at Running Aces. The final table is going to be broadcast by Next Level Poker. We've got 45 to 50 regular bounties already scheduled, probably about $10,000 in bounties. The prize pool will get split between the charity and actual cash payouts. The flyer is almost done and will be up on the Running Aces website soon. And then we've added an All In for Africa Hawaiian Dream Winner Take Most tournament. And that's going to be Thursday, November 2nd at 6 p.m. at Running Aces. And the way this is going to work is that whoever wins the tournament is going to get this Hawaiian trip for 2 valued at about $9,500. First class flights from Minneapolis to Hawaii. Some ground transportation will be covered. 7 days, 6 nights at the Four Seasons Resort on Maui and $100 per day resort credit. Estimated value $9,500. So that's going to go to the winner. But we're also going to put some tournament lammers in play for probably at least 2nd through 5th place. So it's not quite winner take all, but it is winner take most. And so final details are being worked out. You can check out runaces.com and kind of stay tuned there, and I'll keep you updated on here as well. All right, so we're going to go to a quick commercial featuring our sponsor, thanks to them, and then we'll hear some audio submitted by Jonathan Little, and then we'll continue the conversation with Rob Washam, John Somsky, Derek Smith, and Andy Kaplan. Thanks for joining us. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack has the best poker room in Minnesota, featuring 24/7 promos on all cash poker games, including earning $2 per hour in comps, plus the most player-friendly tourney structures. Visit runaces.com for daily promotions and the tournament calendar. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack, the official sponsor of Rec Poker.
Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little. I'm here today continuing to go over Secrets of Professional Tournament Poker Volume 1 for the Rec Poker Podcast Book Club. So far, if you have not listened to the previous parts of this book review, definitely go back and listen to them because those have all been discussing how to play deep stacked. Today we're going to discuss how to play as your stack starts to diminish. So we call deep stacked 125 big blinds and more. And, in reality, if I was to rewrite this book today, it'd probably be something like 75 big blinds or more. But anyway, today we're going to be discussing, 40-ish big blind stacks and then also shorter than 40 big blind stacks. So in general, as your stacks start to diminish to, something like 70 big blinds, 60 big blinds, 50 big blinds, 40 big blinds, you typically want to play a little bit tighter as the stacks get shorter. And that's because hands that have implied odds, such as suited connectors, small pairs, and ace-x suited, those lose a lot of their value because those hands really rely on getting paid a huge amount when they make the best hand. So for example, if you have a hand like 8-7 suited, you're not going to make a straight or a flush very often. But when you do, you want to make sure you're getting paid a huge return on your investment. So if you have to put in 3 big blinds before the flop, if you can win 100 big blinds, you're getting 33 to 1 on your money. But if you can only win, let's say, 20 big blinds, but now you're getting 8-1 on your money. And that's way worse. Actually, you're getting 7-1 on your money. It's even worse. And you'd much rather be getting paid 33-1 as opposed to 7-1. So as you start to get shorter stacked, a lot of the hands that rely on implied odds, they start to lose a lot of value. So just keep that in mind. I'm not going to say you shouldn't play them, but calling with a lot of hands, especially when you're not either on the button or in the big blind, just trying to flop well, splashing around trying to flop stuff, often loses a lot of merit. When you do have a premium hand, you have to be willing to get all in with it before the flop, whereas when you're a little bit deeper stacked, say you have pocket queens or ace king, maybe getting it all in for 125 big blinds might be a little bit optimistic because your opponents may only show up with exactly aces or kings. But as you get a little bit shorter stacked, it becomes a little bit more acceptable to get it in with hands like ace, king, and queens. And that's just because the alternative lines are fine. It's okay to play the hands passively, but at the same time, you do want to be able to bluff with some hands, and that kind of implies that you want to be re-raising with the intention of getting it all in with some of your best hands. And this kind of also implies that you have to fear not going broke. I know a lot of players really second-guess themselves every single time they get it all in poorly, or if they just go broke in general. And that has to be okay. I mean, you got to realize when you're playing a poker tournament, you're not going to win very often. If 15% of the players cash, if you cash 15% of the time, that's average. That implies that you are losing 85% of the time. That's more often than pocket aces gets cracked before the flop. Or pocket aces, that's more often than you're going to win with pocket aces when you get it all in before the flop. You're going to be losing. So it's almost like when you start the tournament, you're getting it in with pocket fours versus pocket aces and hoping to get there. And that just doesn't happen very often, right? So you have to understand that. As you start to get shorter, you do not want to put a lot of chips in and then fold. You'll see amateur players do this all the time where they'll raise with ace king to 3 big blinds. Someone will re-raise to 9 big blinds. They'll 3-bet or 4-bet. They'll 4-bet to 25 big blinds. The other player will go all in and then they'll fold their ace king, saying, well, I'm clearly against aces. I got to fold. And that's just not true. Often you're against aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace king. And against that range, getting roughly 2.5 or 3-1 pot odds. Remember, you only need to win 30% of the time at this point because you put in so much of your money. You just have to call. So be aware of that. We briefly touch on limping the button with the stack size, and this is not something I do very often at all. And if I was to write this book today, I'd probably not mention this at this point, but if the players yet to act are very aggressive, say everyone folds you on the button, the small blind, the big blind will re-raise you a ton if you raise, but they will check or call a lot if you limp. That's a pretty good spot just to limp with all of your playable hands. You give up on the opportunity to steal the blinds before the flop, but you ensure that you will get to see the flop virtually every time, because if you limp and then someone raises to 4 or 5 big blinds from out of position, you can just call and see a flop. As your stack diminishes to about 40 to 27 big blinds, there's often a lot of merit in gambling a bit to try to either get a better or a worse stack. This stack is sort of like no man's land. It's a little bit too deep to just shove all in before the flop after someone raises, but at the same time, it's not quite deep stacked to where you can run multi-street bluffs and whatnot. So this is a spot where you really should be looking to splash around a little bit more, just trying to either flop something or steal the pot after the flop or make something happen to where you either get back up to the 60 or so big blind stack or you drop down to 25 big blinds and then you can just shove all in if someone gets or someone raises in front of you. And we discussed this a decent amount. There are a few tactics you can use, but just understand that 30 to 40 big blind stacks are really, really tough to play in a profitable manner. And the other alternative to splashing around a little bit is just play really tight and wait for good hands. And that's not very fun. And just because something's not fun doesn't mean it may not be good. But at the same time, I think there's nothing really wrong with splashing around, especially if your goal is to try to maximize your equity in a tournament. If we're playing a cash game, you should certainly just be tight with a stack size. But in tournaments, you are disproportionately rewarded for winning the tournament. So for that reason, you want to make a point to put yourself in a position to win. Because, going broke's not ideal, but at the same time, you really do want to give yourself a shot to win. And you do that by risking going broke or at least losing some chips with roughly the stack size. As you dip down to about 27 to 15 big blinds, you Whenever everyone folds to you, you can still raise with the intention of folding if someone re-raises you, and that is perfectly fine. But perhaps the most powerful tactic at this stack size is to re-raise all in when someone raises in front of you. So what I mean by this is, let's say someone raises to two or 2.5 big blinds, and you have roughly 10 times or less than their raise. So if they make it 2 big blinds, if you have 20 big blinds or less, you can often just go all in with all of your playable hands. And this is going to put your opponents in tough spots because they have to put in 18 more big blinds, which is a pretty good amount. And your range should presumably be decent. We go through a formula in this chapter that explains how you can do some math to see if you can shove all in much wider than only good hands. And we also discuss how to figure out how much equity you need to have when you get called based on what your opponent's raising with. And basically what it amounts to is if your opponent is going to fold versus you're all in a lot, you can go all in with a lot of hands because your opponent's going to fold way too often. If your opponent's going to call you all in a lot, then you need to make sure you have a reasonably strong hand because you're going to get called. If you're going to get called, you want to make sure that you have a reasonably strong hand. From there, we start to discuss very short stacked play, 12 to 5 big blind stacks. And once you get down to this short of a stack, you just need to be going all in or folding when everyone folds to you, or even when there are limpers in front of you for the most part. Since I wrote this book, we actually made a free application over at floattheturn.com called the Float the Turn Push Fold app. It's completely free. You can also download it on the iTunes or Android App Store. And basically, you type in your stack size, you type in your position, and it will tell you which hands you need to go all in with. And from there, you can actually use this at the poker table when you're in between hands. You can just push a next button, and it moves you to the next seat over. So say you're on the button with 7 big blinds, and they fold to you, and you have a hand you don't want to go all in with. You just click next, and now next hand, it moves you automatically to the cutoff. And then you click next again, it moves you to the hijack. Say you do go all in from the hijack and you steal the blinds, it bumps you up about 2 big blinds, because that's how much you'd steal when you steal the blinds. And then you're in the low jack seat on the next hand with 9 big blinds. So anyway, it's a really, really handy program. It's really easy to use at the table, which makes it very, very beneficial. And the students who have been using that app have had great success, and I highly suggest you check it out. Again, it's the Float the Turn Push Fold app, completely free at floattheturn.com in the tool section. Whenever you do have a short stack and people raise in front of you, you have to realize that you're going to get called virtually every time whenever you're shoving for 8 big blinds. Because if someone makes it 2 big blinds and you go on for 8, they realize they only need to win about 35 or 40% of the time to break even. And if they're opening with any sort of a reasonable range, they are going to win that often. So against those players, you need to be willing to be somewhat patient and just get it all in when you are decently ahead. Now, you don't need a huge advantage. And really, you can get it all in with 50% equity if you think you're only going to be heads up because there are dead blinds and antes in the pot. So imagine you have, let's say, 10 big blinds. You know you're getting called every time, and you know you're going to win exactly half the time. That may sound like a spot you want to avoid because you're quote-unquote flipping. The thing is that if there are 22 big blinds in the pot, because there are blinds and antes in the pot, and you know you're going to win half the time, and you're only putting in 10 big blinds, well, you're going to profit 1 big blind in this hand, which is fantastic. It's hard to profit more than 10% of your stack on average. Now, you have to risk going broke to get this 1% advantage, but that's a huge edge. And anytime you have that situation, you need to be willing to go for it. You must be willing to go broke as you get shorter. This is not a spot where you can just sit back, play conservatively, and try to wait for aces or something like that. I actually had someone come to me a long time ago who was a reasonably respected player who said something to the effect of, I'm a great short stack player. I'm so patient. I can wait and wait and wait, and I can wait until I get aces and get in and double up every time. And what he didn't realize is that if he waits for only premium hands, not necessarily just aces, but only premium hands, he's often going to blind down for something like 6 or 8 orbits. And if you blind down for 6 or 8 orbits, you're going to lose 15 or 20 big blinds. You can't lose 15 or 20 big blinds on average waiting for a good hand. And if your opponents are competent, they're going to realize you just waited 15 or 20, or you just blinded off 15 or 20 big blinds, and they're never going to give you action. So you can't play super tight with this stack. You have to be willing to take some risks. I'm not saying you need to just get it all in super wide. I mean, that's the other end of the spectrum where players get down to a short stack and they lose their minds. But you have to play reasonably, and checking out the Float the Turn Push Fold app will help you get a baseline for how to play when everyone folds to you, and from there you can start adjusting based on when there are limpers in front of you, when you're going to get called sometimes, and when there are razors in front of you, when you're going to get called a lot. And finally, in this book, we discuss when you have 5 big blinds or less, basically you're getting called every time whenever you get it all in. However, that concept applies even more of now you're putting in 5 big blinds to win what's going to be a 12 or 13 big blind pot. So you're putting in 5 to win 12, and now you're chopping up that extra big blind, but now that big blind in proportion to your 5 big blind stack is actually a 20% increase, so it's even more. There's a concept in tournaments that as your stack gets shorter, your stack becomes more valuable, and that's because with a 5 big blind stack, you can still run it up and end up winning the tournament. And actually, I've won a World Poker Tour event after I've been down to 8 big blinds. At the end of day 1 of the World Poker Tour Mirage tournament I won, I lost a big flip with pocket 10s versus ace king, and I had 8 big blinds. I came back the next day and just won every hand I played, and I won the tournament. I've also seen a player come back from 1 ante with 27 players left. I actually had half the chips in play at a final table. When this guy came back from 1 ante with 27 people, he ended up winning the tournament, and I took 7th place. So that was a lot of fun. Anything can happen in poker tournaments, and you really need to make a point to not just throw away your short stacks. So that is actually the end of this book, and it may seem like it kind of abruptly ends because we don't actually discuss how to play short-handed, how to play final table scenarios, how to actually live the life of a pro, and that is because all of that is covered in Secrets of Professional Tournament Poker Volume 2. So I definitely suggest you check that out, and maybe if you all enjoy this, we can do a book club review of that here on the Rec Poker Podcast. I want to thank you all for listening to this. Definitely check out pokercoaching.com. Again, if you want to learn how to put all of these tactics into practice, that is by far the best way to go and learn about these things. Also, be sure to check out the free applications we have over at floattheturn.com under the tools section. So thank you very much. This has been Jonathan Little. Feel free to let me know what you think about this on Twitter at Jonathan Little, and I will talk to you soon.
All right, why don't we shift to chapters 10 through 15? So now we're starting to get into the conversation with having fewer chips. So the way the book is really laid out is, here's everything about deep stack poker, and then we have this miscellaneous chapter where we kind of look at all these other topics. And now these last few chapters are getting into how do we play as our chip stack starts to drop. So I've got a few things I can talk about, but why don't I just open it up and see what you guys have as far as either insights or questions.
This is Andy. Just my thought of the first part of the chapter, when you're, it's 125 to 60 big blinds, which is really a big stack. He's basically just saying keep the pedal to the metal and keep playing aggressive. Play pot control, play tight, but play aggressive. And it's my impression is he kind of is saying, keep your foot on the accelerator.
He seems to be more apt to go all in with a strong hand at that level than he was at what he calls the deep stack, which is over 125. In this chapter 10, he talks about actually being prepared to go all in when you do have a strong hand with that chip stack.
Yeah, for sure, which is something that we look at as playing the weeklies at, some of the casinos that we play. And you're like, well, that's a monster stack.
Yeah.
So we do need to, there's some sort of a scale that we need to figure out, so whether it's the 60 to 125 or whatever it is, I think the point being as you move from whatever you consider to be a super deep stack to sort of a medium stack size, you need to start looking at, okay, this is where I start to be willing to put my chips all in the middle if I need to in the right position. And I think we've talked about it already, I think there is that balance of, yeah, but as I get shorter, there's more fear of busting. So it's that variance piece. You're going to either, go big or go home, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think the main part of that getting all in with a strong hand was don't slow play it. Go ahead and bet it out, because if somebody has a hand that they can call with, you're going to get paid. If they don't, they're not going to be around anyway. So slow playing a monster is not a good idea, because either he'll catch up by giving him free cards, or, he won't give you any more chips anyway if he doesn't have anything. So go ahead and bet, because if he has something, he'll come along, and if he doesn't, he's going to fold either way.
And I think it's such an important thing to note. Like he talks about as we go from deep stack to shallower stack, how the sort of your hand selection changes, but also how you view big hands and I guess speculative hands so differently. So you have pocket aces and you have 200 big blinds. You don't want to overplay that because the reverse implied odds are so big. You're either going to win a relatively small pot or you're going to lose a huge pot. So you don't want to go crazy with those. But as you get shallower and shallower, you need to look for the double ups. And, the downside is not as big because now you only have 50 big blinds, so you don't have as big of a downside. You need to win that. And conversely, the speculative hands, you play those when you're deeper stack because they have such good positive implied odds where you're either going to lose a small hand or win a big hand. But as you get closer and closer and your stack diminishes, those speculative hands, those small pocket pairs, those 8-9 suiteds, lose a lot of value because you don't have the same upside potential in terms of number of big blinds as you did earlier in the tournament. So I think that's such a good paradigm to think of, how your big hands, the aces, kings, queens, ace, king, actually become more valuable as you go deeper in the tournament and you want to play them more aggressively, and the speculative hands actually lose value, and you may just want to open fold those later in the tournament versus early in a tournament where you're looking to get a big double up.
Yeah, that's definitely the way he's laid it out here, and it really makes a lot of sense because he talks earlier about implied odds with your suited connectors and your small pairs, that they have a lot of implied odds against somebody who's raising you pre-flop because he's probably got the upper end of the scale, and if you hit your hand, it's so well disguised you're going to get paid off. And if you don't hit your hand, it's bad enough that you can get rid of it and you're not going to lose that much.
Right, you've only lost maybe 3% of your stack versus later in a tournament you maybe lose 20% of your stack trying that.
Correct. And like you said, you're not going to get paid with as many big blinds if you do hit. So that's where your stronger hands, your aces, your kings, your queens, the big hands, are the hands you want to try to get and be aggressive with and play strongly and hope to get all in with.
And even to the point where, this is good, Rob, even to the point where, say you have, maybe we're going too shallow a stack, but if you're down to 30 big blinds, and with blinds and antes in the middle, say there's 2.5 big blinds in the middle, if you just are willing to go crazy and, play really aggressive with your aces, you pick up 3 big blinds, well, that's 10% increase to your stack. That's not immaterial at that point in the tournament.
Exactly. And by doing that, and if you've been consistent throughout the tournament, you're going to have aces, but everybody's going to say, well, he could do this with just about anything. And so you're probably going to get paid off with those aces a lot more using Jonathan's strategy throughout this whole thing than you would if you were just sitting there waiting for those aces.
Yeah, I also liked his mention of the all-in squeeze play. When you have a stack size of about anywhere from 30 to 40 blinds, maybe even 25, someone raises, if you have a decent hand and something that's likely not going to be dominated, push all in with it, and you'll usually take it down, and if not, you should have a fair amount of equity still left in the pot.
It's absolutely one of my favorite plays in the tournaments that I play. It just is. Somebody in late position that's a good player, knows the power of position, whether on the button or on the cutoff, makes a 3x raise and you get, 1 or 2 calls from the button and blinds and you have the 25 bigs and just shove it in there. Oh, it's such, it works so often. It's got to be 80% plus. And you pick up like 10 big blinds to add to your 25 big blind stack. It's monstrous. And like you said, if you get called, you're still going to have some equity. It's one of my favorite plays in the recreational game.
I agree completely, Steve. I wrote this down, so it sounds like we all kind of have recognized this as a play, at least in the games we play. I love this, in particular, the one I find is and it might seem wrong, but from out of position, I like when I'm in the blinds. So you get someone that opens, but then someone will just limp. They just call from behind, from the hijack or the cutoff, whatever, from the button. I mean, I'm liable to jam anything from the small or the big at that spot, because it particularly if that initial raise is from under the gun or under the gun +2, maybe not. But in general, if you're getting the middle position or later, and then someone just calls behind, I just cannot discount that call more. So whether or not that first raiser does have some decent equity, I feel like with almost any two cards, I mean, within reason, I'm willing to just get that in there. And it's so powerful. Like you said, if you're jamming over for another 15 blinds or something, I mean, you can almost guarantee to 100% that at least that second caller is going to fold. And the trouble is, for the first raiser, they still have to go, well, shit, I not only have to call this all in, but what if this guy behind me goes all in? What if they're slow playing something? And I think a lot of rec players don't think that, well, he only called me. He cannot have, he very rare. If he's got something huge, like, good on him. That's a really nice play in those games. So,
Well,
like,
it works.
it's a pretty rare scenario, but it's hard when you're that first person that opened and got called and then someone jammed over and you go, well, now I got someone acting behind me without, you know what I mean? They can put me to the test now too. So I absolutely love that play from the blinds, but I think what you guys might have been describing, you don't even have to be from the blinds, but I like it from the blinds. So.
Well, it works particularly well too when the opening raiser is someone who is an aggressive player. So you know that their range is really wide. It's going to be really hard for them to call. And you know that whoever called was weak, particularly if they recognize that the original raiser's range is really wide, because they would have raised if they had anything of value.
Right. They've just got Queen Jack there, and they think they might be ahead, but they're not going to re-raise it. And yeah, and you know, I bet, you know, so often when I do that play, the original raiser looks at me and says, "You got crap," but they still can't call because they got crap too, or it's too big of a percentage of their stack. You know, even if they have ace 10 or pocket fives, it's kind of hard for them to call.
And that all-in squeeze play in that situation, that kind of goes back to what we were talking about before too. Is that's a great play, but I think sometimes that's a hard play for a recreational player to make because it's aggressive. And I think that's the exact play when we were talking before about, you know, making those plays to win a tournament. I think that's a great example of you got to make those plays to win tournaments because they're the plays that are going to build your chip stack.
Yeah, and I'm a big believer in looking for those opportunities that are there, and I think that is one of those opportunities that comes our way. And I know I've watched situations where people could have done that, and I'm just inside my mind going, boy, they should just be shoving here almost any two. And I think it's been a transition for me lately is not trying to create those opportunities, because I used to think, okay, I've got to make something happen, so I'd maybe take that opportunity that really wasn't there because I just wanted it to be there, versus now just looking for it and just kind of seeing it almost as plain as day. You know, whether it's that situation, yeah, let the game come to you versus trying to just always make opportunities happen. And I think this is one of those opportunities that you're not going to see every tournament, but when it's there, I think it's something you really need to consider taking advantage of.
Well, that goes back to when you had Blake Bone on, and he said, you know, he'll never complain about being card dead in a tournament, but he will complain about being spot dead.
So that's an interesting thing, and I'd love to hear, you know, one of you guys, John or whoever, elaborate more on that, because it's something you hear from recreational players all the time is, yeah, you know, I ran good early and then I just got card dead. And what I'm hearing is, you know, there's somebody out there saying there's no such thing as being card dead, it's spot dead. And I totally agree with that, but maybe one of you guys can elaborate that and help people kind of sort out what that means, because a lot of people are sitting there listening to this going, what are you talking about? I was card dead. I didn't get anything above a jack for 2 hours. What do you mean by that?
Well, so how many hands do you win without having to go to showdown? Most of them, right? So it doesn't matter what your cards were. So you had a situation where you were able to win the pot by applying pressure and everyone folded to you. And it's just recognizing those situations where that's likely to be the case and then applying the pressure. It's that squeeze play. Like you said, there are spots where you're thinking that guy should push no matter what 2 cards they have because it's such a good spot. And I think that's where the skill in poker really starts to come in. It's recognizing those spots. And as recreational players, we probably only recognize 5% or 2% of them. And we need to start to learn more of them. Or we think there's a spot and it turns out it really isn't a good spot because we're not recognizing, how strong the player is or how they're reacting to it. So it's really about finding spots where you're basically attacking weakness. You have to find the weakness, attack it, and take advantage of it because those chips could be yours.
I think one thing you said there, it raised an interesting question for me. Like, I know a lot of recreational players that I play with that I bet their percentage of hands that they actually win, their percentage of pots that they win, that went to showdown is significantly higher than certainly myself or other of the professionals. So like you said, how many of the pots that you win did you actually go to showdown and have to show your hand with? Not very many. And you kind of took that for granted. But I think there's a lot of recreational players that, because they're not playing very aggressively, most of the hands that they win are at showdown because they're just calling down, and I don't think they're winning a lot of hands. So I think that might be a good temperature check for you listeners to consider is, how often, when I win a pot, how often is it at showdown where I actually have the best hand, and how often is it because I was just able to win the pot by betting? I think that's an interesting take.
Yeah, and if you're winning most of your pots at showdown like that, you aren't playing poker, you're playing roulette or scratch-off tickets. You're playing luck. And the skill in the game comes from winning pots with the worst hand. Whoever wins the most pots with the worst hand.
Exactly.
Exactly. So, and the type of players who are going to win most of them at showdown are probably the passive type players who are just pushing money in the pot. There are other types of players who are, those tight rock players who will play aggressively, but anytime they bet, everyone gets out of the pot because they have aces, kings, ace, king, maybe ace, queen if they're feeling a little frisky.
Well, they're not going to 3-bet with it, but they might open with it.
Right.
Well, and one of the other symptoms I would say too is something that, the old cliche of if you never get caught bluffing, then you're not bluffing enough. And obviously we can take that too far, but I think that's another symptom. If you're asking yourself, am I just too passive of a player? Ask yourself how often you get caught bluffing. If it's hardly ever, if never, you might want to reconsider or at least think about adding some aggressiveness to your game.
To that Blake quote, even though I know it's just going back to that too, I think if you think about it, on all of us have, well, most people have probably had that one magical tournament or whatever. They just ran over the field. You just kept catching hand after hand after hand. It's ridiculous. That happens every once in the hugest blue moon that's ever come around. But in general, that doesn't happen. So I think 99% of the time, everyone is technically card dead. The game of poker is you're going to be card dead. You're going to get pocket pairs very rarely, and they're going to be shitty ones half or more of the time. Everyone is going to be card dead in the long run. So there really isn't such a thing as, well, I was going really good for an hour, and then I was just super card dead for an hour, and then I busted out. What do you mean? I hear people tell me that, oh, I was running really great, and I was just super card dead for the next hour, so I just jammed this weird hand. Everyone's card dead the whole time. That's the nature of the game of poker. So to John and Steve, to you guys' point, that if you understand that going in, that's why you have to be going after and battling for all those little pots, raising pre and stealing all the things that Jonathan is kind of recommending from this book. We're all everyone's card dead. We all come in card dead. We should all know we're going to be card dead all the way through. If you're going to win this tournament, you've got to figure out another way to win the tournament, because if you're relying on coming in and not being card dead and winning the tournament because you had great cards all the way through, good luck to you.
You know, and one of the things that, you know, when I like to ask questions, and, you know, when I talk to people that busted tournaments and they're card dead all the time, and I start to explore that a little bit because I try to understand what that means. What I find out a lot is they were playing a lot of hands that I think they probably shouldn't be playing, and they just weren't hitting like maybe they do sometimes. So, like, oh yeah, you know, I kept picking up like Jack 10, Jack 9, 10 8, and, you know, I mean, of course you play those hands sometimes, but like, you know, my Ace 9, my King 9, you know, all these hands that they just weren't hitting. I couldn't hit anything. And, you know, sometimes I wonder, are we just playing too many of the wrong kind of hands, especially early? And maybe to John's point earlier, you know, chips that are not spent are chips that are earned in a sense. And so I think there is some of that. When I think people say card dead, some people I think mean I never picked up aces or kings. And some people I think mean I was playing as many hands as I always play, and I just wasn't hitting the board. You know, or man, I'd hit a king with my king 7 and I kept getting out kicked. That sort of thing. So I'm always curious when people say card dead. I think it does mean different things, but I think often it's just playing way too many hands and just not getting lucky flops.
I think that's a very good observation, Steve. I think that's what a lot of people are doing. But going back to that quote, I was spot dead. There was somebody on your podcast that you interviewed that made that statement, because I remember hearing it on one of your guests said it.
I was trying to remember if it was Koo or if it was maybe Fox said it. I agree. I did hear it, but it couldn't have been Blake.
Yeah, I think
maybe Fox might have
might
referenced Blake saying it, maybe, because I know that's a Blake statement, but I think Fox might have said, like, one of my buddies, Blake, always says this, because I agree, I have heard it before. But anyways, long story short, I agree. It's a very realistic thing. Could be, yeah, that's fair. Could be. Oh, that's right, because he did coaching with him. Yep, good call.
You'd think whoever interviewed these guys would remember, but I don't.
Hey, that's fair, Steve.
I've listened to all of the episodes, and I don't know, so... Hey.
Okay, fair enough. Did you have more to say about that, Rob, or just kind of in agreement with that?
Well, no, just I wanted to agree, and, you know, and I think being card dead, I think I've said it myself, and what I really meant was spot dead, because you'll find those spots where you have those hands that you could make a play with, because, you know, the blinds are going to fold, they're kind of weak, but that moment you get that hand is when somebody raised in front of you, and you don't have a good enough hand to re-raise them, or the chip stack to play that level, whatever it is. So you miss out on that spot. So that happens so often. It's not that, you know, like Derek said, everybody's card dead all the time. But it's just when you get into those tournaments, and it's happened every now and again where, God, you could make a play, you could make that move, but somebody already made a different move that you can't counteract with the cards you have, or the person is too aggressive to your left, he's a maniac, you can't really play it that way. You have to wait and be a little tighter. You know, those spots just don't happen. Drives you crazy.
One good thing, though, to learn from that is if you're finding a situation where you're spot dead, like let's say the chip leader is directly on your right and opening almost every hand, and you're sitting on a short stack, it makes, you know, greatly diminishes your fold equity, and it's really hard to push over the top of them. You know, you can't open push hardly any hands, and that is one spot where you might think you're spot dead. But then you can use that if you ever become the chip leader. You know, I've been in tournaments where it's like 5 people left in the on the table, and I have 50% of the chips in play. When I'm in that situation, I'm raising almost 100% of the time when it's open folded to me, because everyone else is looking to ladder up, because we're at a point in the tournament where there's significant pay increases for each little bit that you ladder up. It's a significant portion of their chip stack if they push, and most likely I've already shown that I'm willing to call down a little light because it doesn't really matter to my chip stack if I think I have the proper equity in the pot. So everyone else is basically just hemorrhaging their chips to me because they can't afford to call and I can't afford not to raise.
It's the best spot ever. I love that spot so much. Yeah. What I love even more is like when it's on the bubble, and this is where some of the strategy comes in. Where it's on the bubble and you're in that situation, maybe there's a few tables left, but everybody at your table's pretty short, and they're all just trying to get in the money, and you keep raising. And the interesting part about that is that dynamic. But then I've actually called and somebody shoved against me, and I've had ace king and I just folded. And the reason I did, not because I didn't think I was way ahead, is because the situation was too good. Like, I didn't want anybody to bust because they were giving me like 20,000 chips, every hand. And so I don't want anybody to bust because as soon as that happens, it's going to be a free-for-all. So I actually liked the dynamic of I'm just going to wait till the next one and just keep taking these chips on every hand and try not to bust somebody, which is sort of ironic.
Hey, Steve, kind of I apologize for the sidebar, but way back to the very first episode, I feel like there was one thing that was kind of missed that when we discussed that, like where you have the very smallest stack, why that's really profitable. We talked about that. And I think something that we didn't kind of cover / I just didn't say in my piece, it might be a little bit related to what you're discussing, although I know you probably weren't specifically talking about, when there's short stack final table kind of thing is the power in that small stack is kind of what you might just be describing there is, a big stack isn't going to want to pick on a small stack necessarily because the small stack is just going to jam on you. And then what are you going to do? You're going to want to pick on those medium stacks because they don't want to bust. There's small stacks that are sitting there, on money bubbles, on final table bubbles or whatever, any bubble there is. And it might be a bit of a leap, kind of what you were just describing, jumping in on this, but I think that I kind of missed that when we were discussing that on why having the small stack sometimes can be powerful, because you're not the person big stacks really want to pick on or shouldn't be thinking about picking on, because really you kind of pose a threat to the larger stack as a small stack, just in the sense that what do you got to lose? You can jam on them. But the middle stack, that's who you want to put pressure on when you're a big stack, because they don't want to bust out. Now they got all these small, they got a couple small stacks between the two tables left or whatever, if we're, down to the money with 16 left or something. And if I'm a middle stack, I'm like, there's 3 people at my table and 3 at that table that have well covered. I'm not busting 16th. Those are the people you want to really put pressure on. So I think maybe a little bit and I could be wrong, I apologize, but I kind of think what you're describing too kind of can come into play in those like bubble positions in place too, which again kind of relates back to why sometimes being the smaller stacks, which isn't exactly what we were just describing, but another reason why some of those having that stack and being able to have that, like, I'm going to jam on anything you bet, can have some power. So
no, I think the middle stacks, yeah, for sure. The middle stacks are the ones that can afford to fold, and those are the ones that you can really kind of hammer on, as exactly what you're saying. From an ICM perspective, it's a mistake for them to get into a big hand without a big hand themselves, and so they'll fold a lot more. And so that's where there is almost some strategic value in keeping some of those small stacks alive, as weird as that kind of sounds. But yeah, there is, it is a more profitable. It's profitable to be short stacked because you kind of have one decision, and just picking up the blinds can increase your stack by 10-20%.
Well, also,
yeah.
I think it was.
And I don't. Go ahead, sorry.
I think it was in one of David Sklansky's books, maybe The Theory of Poker, where he was mentioning, if you're actually the shortest stack at the table, then you should be playing ultra aggressively because you've got nothing to lose. Right now, you've won all of the money you're going to win. You need to get a bigger stack in order to secure yourself more money. So you should be playing even more aggressively if you're the smaller, unless the middle stacks are battling against each other and just busting each other out for you.
Which probably doesn't regularly happen. So I think that kind of backs up the point, and I think you're exactly right. I feel like I've read that somewhere too, where, I mean, you think about like a small stack, we'll just make up fake numbers here, but if the biggest stack in the room's got 100K and the smallest, let's say there's 5 people left, so the chip leader's got 100K and the small stack's got 10K, and then 3 people have like 50. There is absolutely zero incentive for the people with 50 to play a hand. You should not play a hand. But from ITM considerations, you got to wait for that 10K to bust. And so the 10K has as much power in a weird scenario as the big stack, because the big stack is going to pick on those middle stacks if it's free picking. And meanwhile, the big stack probably doesn't want the small stack to bust, because if he busts the small stack this next hand, now the middle stack's like, all right, let's go to war and see who gets second, or doubles up. They actually, like you said, Steve, I think you kind of almost want the small stack to stay in, because you can keep picking off the middle stacks, and pretty soon 3 people in the middle only have 30,000. Meanwhile, the first place stack has jumped up to 130,000.
Yeah, no, I've had people at final tables just give me the evil eye when, all of a short stack, because it's exactly that situation. All of a short stack shove on me and I'm the big stack, and he'll shove for like 4 big blinds, and I might even be in the blind and I'll fold. And it has nothing to do with, what I think the expected value of that play is. It has everything to do with what's my ICM implication here of having them bust, and then exactly what you said, the middle stacks now go to war, and one of the 2 of them doubles up, and now I'm tied with one of them for the chip stack. I'd much rather, if I got 100K, there's a couple 50Ks, and then the 10K. I'd rather let that 10K survive and get it down to so I have 150K and they each have 30K. To me, I don't know if it's right or wrong, but that's strategically how I think about that.
I don't know if that's right or wrong either, and I know this isn't specifically anything that we read or that Jonathan described, so we've probably gone off tangent a little bit. I mean, to me, that's always made just common sense that that's what you would do. So it is. I 1,000,000% agree with you. And so that, I think, sometimes comes back to why being in the small stack, besides kind of getting called off with like weaker range and things from people or whatever from the small stack is profitable. That's another part, is sometimes the big stick doesn't want you gone. They go ahead, if you get 10 grand, go ahead, take the blanks for 2,500. I still have 100,000 or 97.5 now. Like, I don't care. Go ahead. I want you still in so I can keep dominating those middle stacks.
Yeah. But here's a question that Doug Drabeck had raised. He said it was a question about aggression. He said the book would recommend going all in with ace queen with 20 big blinds. Doug said I would wait for better spots or only do this on the button or cutoff. When do others consider going all in? And obviously there's different dynamics with where we're at in the tournament and stuff. But how do you guys feel about ace queen with 20 bigs?
No, I was just going to say that I think in Jonathan Little's example, he was willing to go all in over an aggressive pre-flop raiser.
A loose raiser, yeah.
Right. A very aggressive, he's going to raise wide, aggressive player. He's not saying just open, going all in open with an ace queen. He was talking about reacting to a loose, aggressive pre-flop raise.
Yeah, I agree. That was the situation. And how do you feel about that with 20 bigs?
Well, what are you going to re-raise it to if you're going to re-raise it? What are you going to re-raise it to when you only got 20 bigs? You're pretty much putting. One of the things he said earlier too is if you put more than a third of your stack in jeopardy, just go all in. So basically that matches up pretty well, because if a guy raises 2.5, 3 big blinds pre-flop, now you're going to have to go to 9?
Yeah, at least 7 or 8 if you're really playing it tight. And
right.
That's still
Which is easily over a third of your stack. So you're going to go all in anyway, based on what he said earlier in the book. So yeah, 3-betting all in with ace queen is definitely against the right player.
I'd be curious your thought on this. The one thing I see a lot of at the table, kind of in this situation, is people will just call with ace queen, and then see if they hit an ace or a queen, and then get it all in. That way, they're not risking their tournament life. What's your take on that?
I would never call with ace queen anymore. I might have a year ago.
Not with 20 big blinds. I think you gotta push there. Otherwise, if you're folding, now you've just lost half your stack, right, or a third of your stack.
Well, if you were just to call call the 3 big blind raise, and then check fold the flop if you don't connect, you only lose 3 big blinds. And I'm not recommending that, but I do see that quite a bit. Like, I just wanted to see if I would hit.
Yeah, it has to do with knowing your opponent again. There's certain opponents that that they only come in with a raise with aces, kings, or ace king. There's people that do that. And if that's the kind of person it is, well, then, you're better off just folding that ace queen. But if it's an aggressive guy that is willing to put it in with king, queen, king 10, maybe a small pair like sixes or sevens, he's going to raise pre-flop. And you got ace queen, yeah, that's a good time to get it all in.
Or if it's someone who overvalues their tournament life and you happen to have one more big blind than they do.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, you'll see people count it out, and they'll even say, they might count it out there and they have 19 big blinds, and they'll even say, well, if I had you covered, I would have called you. Like surviving with 1 big blind is the goal. You know what I mean? But it is an interesting dynamic that comes into play.
And it kind of comes back to what we talked about on the last episode when we were talking about ranges, I think, or maybe that was the first episode. I mean, in order for him, you're going all in for 20 big blinds. Depending on where the stack sizes are, you're putting a lot of pressure on someone that now has to call you. He's going to have he's only going to call you with a very select group of hands. And the idea is that it's very unlikely that he's going to have aces, kings, jacks, queens to make that call. So I think long term, that's a high reward all in, because most of the time he's folding there.
Yep, I agree. Anybody disagree with that?
I won't say that I disagree with it. I just have to tell you that I'm like this is a thing I think I struggle with. So just being completely transparent. If I've got 20 blinds in the tournament, I don't. In no way do I feel like I need to make a move this second. Like I think we've all done well in tournaments before, getting to 20 blinds and potentially lower. I guess I don't really freak out at 10 big blinds, and I know that's not optimal, but I'm just saying, and this might be because I definitely, and I appreciate the book from John, kind of learning to be Jonathan again, sorry, being a little more aggressive, or a lot more aggressive is probably more proper, but I'm not overly aggressive, so I'm used to playing, as the game continues, I'm used to being in that 10-20 range, and that in no way at all makes me oh crap, I've got to do something right now. So ace queen to me is it's all right. And so if it's a loose aggressive person, I completely understand. I jam over that, and I'm all for picking up 5 big blinds. I totally understand the value of scooping 20-25% value in your chips, so I'm not disagreeing with that, but I don't think that it's panic time at 20 big blinds and I gotta get it. I look down at ace queen, I gotta get it in. I think it's back to, I apologize, I think maybe John said it, you gotta know your opponent still, and if they're loose aggressive, sure, I'll get it in against that person. If they woke up with a big hand, everyone wakes up with hands, that'll happen, and you go home smiling. But I think aside from knowing your person, or your villain, if you will, I don't personally think you have to be jamming anything that's viable with 20 big blinds. And this is probably a departure from Jonathan Little's book, and I'm in no way saying I'm a better poker player than Jonathan. I just don't. At the tournaments I play, I'm at 20 big blinds all the time.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's just normal. There could be 9 people left in the tournament. We all have about 20 big blinds. I'm not jamming everything that's winnable at that point. Knowing your person is good and being able again to pick up 2, 3, 4, 5 big blinds is definitely valuable. But I think a lot of times in that scenario, I'm willing to take a flop there, or even just 3-bet somebody there, and they might lay it down there, and I'll kind of see what they do. I realize betting for information is terrible, but I think in the tournaments that a lot of us play, you're at 20 blinds within an hour of playing the tournament. I mean, that's a very different scenario than what Jonathan's doing, where when you buy in, you have 300 big blinds to start, and day 2, day 3, if you're doing okay, you're at 20 big blinds, in WPTs and some of the things he's playing. Well, for me, I'm in that scenario an hour or two into the game, and it's not because I wasn't building a stack. I'm cruising along just fine. But at this point in time, most of these tournaments are, at Aces and Canterbury, they're kind of jam fests at that point. There's more of like all ins or folds. There's not a ton of play. And I think this is where it's a bit of a departure from his book. And again, his book says this is for professional players, so therefore you're playing in events that are $3,500, $5,000, $10,000. You're going to get some play in those events. So I completely respect that he didn't say, I'm writing a book for guys that play $50 tournaments, But I think it's worthwhile, worth keeping track of that is the bulk of the people that listen to this podcast are playing those level of those kind of that style of events. So being at 20 big blinds, 25 big blinds, to me that's not short. It's just not. So
I agree. I agree with that too. I think when I was looking at this, especially the end of this book, when he starts talking about stack sizes and short stack sizes, the one thing that I kind of took it with a grain of salt. When he's talking about gambling to get a better stack and all that, he's talking about 25 big blinds usually. That's kind of his version of a short stack. And
where you're the puny stack at the table.
Where the tournaments we're playing, I think 10 big blinds is more when I feel like I'm on a short stack, just when we're playing in a rec tournament. And I think that is a difference between what he's talking about and what we see in the rec tournaments we play in.
Yeah, but keep in mind when he talks about gambling to get a bigger stack, he was also talking about when everybody else at the table has like 50 big blinds and you're sitting there with 30 big blinds. Then you try to gamble to get a bigger stack, but you wouldn't do that if you're sitting there with 30 big blinds and everybody else has 30 big blinds.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
He does talk to that too.
Yeah, and I think I love that section of the book because I love that theory of using whatever's above a short stack to gamble with. I just think, at least in my scenario, I think of that more less of a stack. I mean, I look at probably 10 big blinds as being a short stack, whereas that he's talking more like 20 big blinds. And I just wonder if that's just the nature of the tournaments we play in, but maybe not. Maybe that's not the case because our tournaments go pretty fast too. But I tend to agree that I don't know that 20 big blinds is a short stack.
I was Andy. I think what you were saying. Sorry, I just was going to say that I think what you're describing is exactly what I was kind of thinking, and I was kind of taking everything he said. Again, he clearly knows better than I do, but I was kind of taking what he described and cutting it in half, only just to kind of make sense for our tournament. So when he said like 60 to 125, I was like, well, this is like 35 to 70 big. So when he's talking about like 40 to 60, I'm like, when I'm at like 20 to 30. So when he started talking about like when you're in the 5 to 12 big blind, I guess you'd be in trouble then. But when you're like the 10 to 20, I'm like, okay, this is exactly in the wheelhouse. Like this, I was super pumped to read that chapter because I'm like, I'm in this scenario, and so is every friend I play with. We talk about it all the time. I either get into a final table with like 9 left and I have a monster amount of chips, or I'm in trouble. I have like 9 bigs. Well, so do like 6 other people out of the 9 that are left. So what's the optimal? Like, how do I make my way to third or second and make that money? The top 3 money. So, anyways, I just kind of cut all his. I love his recommendations, but I kind of cut the big blinds maybe in half, and kind of took his advice from there. I don't know if that's right or wrong at all. I defer to him for sure, but
that definitely makes a lot of sense. That definitely makes a lot of sense compared to the types of tournaments that we find ourselves in. I have to agree with you 100%, Derek.
Although I agree with you there, Rob, that I think a lot of it was comparing where you're at, your chip stack to everyone else's, because if really it's what your effective stack is. Even if you have a ton of chips, if everyone else only has 10 big blinds, you got to play it like a 10 big blind stack, because that's what you're really playing against.
Extremely good point, John. You're right. Exactly. If you have 20 and you're second in chips out of 9 people, you're jamming anything.
Well, and anyone who's played the Running Aces free roll knows that that's one when you get to the final table, the average stack size is about 5 to 7 big blinds. So, if you're sitting on 7 big blinds, you're the big stack.
No, those are good points. I think the adjustment for the tournaments that we play, I think is super important. I think I agree to some extent, but maybe not as wholeheartedly as everybody else does. Depending on, again, I would say, what's your target? Where are you trying to get to so that you have a reasonable stack when you hit that final table that you can actually go for the win? Because a couple of other things, when you have 20 big blinds in our tournaments, yeah, you might still be well above average. You might still be at a decent stack, but you might still be a long ways away from where you need to be. And so, I'm just not sure that I want to slow down as much. And when you talk about, well, it becomes a shove fest. Well, I agree. It totally becomes a shove fest, in which case Ace Queen is an absolute monster. And the other thing is, if we're playing our tournaments where the blinds are 15-minute levels, I have 20 big blinds now. That means in 30 minutes I'm going to have 10 big blinds. And so it still feels like when there's an opportunity, I need to take it. And that doesn't mean I need to play super desperate with 20 big blinds like, oh man, I've got ace queen, I have to get in every situation, because you'll hear people do that. Well, I had ace queen with 20 big blinds, what was I supposed to do? And you find out that there's a raise and a re-raise all in and a re-raise all in front of them. Well, that's very different than the situation we're talking about here, where it's one raise by a pretty loose player and we shove over the top. So I think that's part of it, is not being desperate in terms of trying to create opportunities, but when the opportunities are there, I think we have to take them, even when we might feel like we're at a comfortable stack size. Okay, so another question that came from Chris Gordon said, I like the comment about paying attention to the way your opponent plays his hands, especially about realizing they might not play the same against different people, and to try to figure out what they think about you. Do you think that deeply about your opponents, or just that they are loose or aggressive tight? We talked about this a little bit, but anybody else have more comments on that in terms of really thinking about how is this opponent playing against me specifically versus just what is their natural sort of poker nature?
I think it's interesting that Chris brought that up, just because I think he's more of a newer player to the game. And I think that's an interesting thing that I kind of never thought of at his kind of level when I was at that level. And so then thinking about it back, I'm like, that is very interesting to think. Like, if I was playing against him or a player of his type, I might react very differently to him, the way I would make my plays, versus another person. So if I were him and I'm very new to the game, I would, I guess, think in my mind that, like, people tell me to say, start to think in my mind of player 1, player 2, like, look around the table and go, this is how they play, this is how that guy plays, this is how that guy plays, and move around the table. And it might be, like, very interesting or worthwhile for a newer kind of player to go, but they don't play that way against every human being. They play that way against me, or watch them play against someone else and watch how they fluctuate their play. I think it's probably an interesting and good learning example for people that are just a little bit more kind of getting into the game, to see that people don't play the same way against no one's tight aggressive all the time, or like ultra loose. They're probably playing the player. So I guess to summarize it, I think his point is pretty well taken, that you do have to kind of see what they do against different styles of players before you kind of put them in a box.
One of the things I keep thinking about during what you just said there, which is really good, is sort of channeling Taylor Moss, who's a big range versus range guy. And so part of this idea of thinking about, are they playing that way just against me, making it personal like that, which is really the same way of saying is, what do they think my range is? And so I think this whole game of decisions is a lot of my range versus your range. What do I think your range is, but also what do I think that you think that my range is, which sounds complicated, but it's really that same way of saying, why are they playing that way against me, or how would they play against me? Do they think my range is wider than normal or tighter than normal? And what does that mean if they're re-raising me? If they're re-raising me, but they think I'm really wide, well, that's a very different thing than if they're re-raising me and they think I'm very tight. So I think at the end of the day, I think all of this conversation about, what's their personality type or what's their sort of player type and what do they think my player type is. Ultimately, it all gets converted somehow into these ranges, and I think that's where the decisions are made in a range versus range sort of manner.
Yeah, I think you're right, Steve. But there's one thing that as you're going through a tournament and you're watching the other players play, and you're not in a hand, but you're watching him because you want to know what kind of player he is. And if you get it in your mind that he's this type of player because of what you saw him do against somebody else, and then assume that he's going to do the same thing to you, you may be making a mistake. And I think that's what Chris was getting to, is how do they play against me versus how do they play against somebody else. So when I'm observing people at the table, I'm trying to get a handle on what kind of player they are. But if I'm only seeing them play against other players, that doesn't mean that's how they're going to play against me, because I don't know what they think I am.
That's good. So if my son Christopher's in the big blind and he's a super tight player, and somebody just keeps pounding his big blind, and then he gets busted, and now they're up against somebody who's super loose, and they start raising that. You have to. Maybe isn't just a maniac. He's just been playing the fact that he's up against a super tight player.
Exactly.
Do you guys think that then, like, let's just pretend you're really tight, and so you watch player X in the, like, 8th seat. Do you think of, I want to watch him play against me, which is great, but I've also found on this table, like, player 4 and 7 are pretty tight too, so I want to see what player 8 does against 4 and 7 because we're all tight. Like, do you know what I mean? Do you want to kind of range a couple other people that are similar to you because you're struggling to kind of range this one player and see what he does against them, because he's probably putting all of you in the same bucket. We probably all do the same thing, you know?
Well, yeah.
I never thought of it in that way. That's kind of interesting, right?
Right. That's exactly what I haven't been doing. I've been just looking to see how he plays in general, assuming he's going to do that all the time.
I know, yeah. It's interesting. I give Chris a lot of credit for kind of pulling that part out of that, and maybe I should give Jonathan more of the credit for it, but it's an interesting thing because I do think I watch players play and I go, well, he played like this. I didn't think about who he played against. I go, he played like this, and then he played like this, he played like this, so he's this. But I didn't go, yeah, but he played like that against this guy, which is fair because think how you play against other people. Like I play completely different things against this guy, and that guy, like completely different. That is an interesting point that is in this book. There's a few things that are just completely, to me, like I have never thought of that. That is one of them for sure. I was like, God, you don't know what you don't know.
Well, yeah, like I think about like if Brian Soja opens, I'm gonna three bet him with 7 deuce Soja. If Rob opens and I 3-bet, I only have aces. Okay, Rob.
Oh, right. I believe that.
I only have aces in that spot.
I think you're getting set up, Rob.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, so I should fold everything then.
That's correct.
I should fold those kings.
I'm gonna get aces a lot next time we play together.
It is a good observation by Chris, though, and by extension by Jonathan about that. 'Cause I don't know that too many of us kind of go that far down to go, yeah, I mean, you're rangy people because you're watching them, and it's like it's hard to keep track of all this happening, and then you're like, I'm going to pay attention to this guy and this guy and this guy, but also my cards and my chips and when I'm betting and all this stuff. But the fact of what they're doing, you can't go, well, this guy's loose aggressive. Well, yeah, but he might have been loose aggressive against the tightest guy on the table. It doesn't mean he's loose aggressive against everyone. So I don't know. It's an interesting point that I haven't really. I think it's a really probably intrinsically kind of something you should have come across ourselves, but. I'll thank Jonathan for that one, and by extension, Chris. So.
Yeah, no, it was good. Let me. I got one more question here, and I know we're running out of time here, so let me take this one, and then if we have other stuff we want to talk about. But Chris had also asked. He says on page 245, Jonathan says, if I had to choose between always pushing the button or never pushing it, I guess some background noise coming in there, but sorry. He says, Jonathan says on 245, he says, if I had to choose between always pushing the button or never pushing it with 9-4 and a 7 big blind stack, I would push it every time as long as I had fold equity. Chris says, it tells to me he's suggesting playing way too many or wide a range of hands when you are short stacked. Do you agree?
I think that if I could jump in, it has to be player dependent, right? Like when you have 9-4, you don't care what your cards are, so your cards don't mean anything. You're jamming against really loose, aggressive people. But guys, with 7 big blinds, how are you not going to get called anyway? What did the person open to? Like 2.5, 2.2. They have to call anyway. So I don't love a 9-4 off.
I think he's referring to when it's
no
folded
equity.
around. I think he's referring to when it's folded around you on the button. Is what I'm assuming.
Oh.
Well, and
then
he
you
did.
just need to know your blinds, right? I would jam that easily if you got some lighter, like players that are a little light in the blinds, depending on ICM considerations and where they are in the tournament stuff. I don't care what my cards at that point. I almost don't even look at them then.
Well, he did say if I have fold equity, so he is taking into account the players that are there at least to some degree. And the question is, if he has fold equity, he would rather err on the side of making the play. And to me, that makes a lot of sense, because if you're sitting on 7 big blinds, if you really want to go far in the tournament, you have to gain chips.
You got to do something. Yeah.
Right. And if you have fold equity, that the other people folding is the least risky way in order to gain chips. So, and if you happen to get called, especially with a hand like 9-4 offsuit or 9-4 suited, whatever it is, you likely have live outs. So, if I'm sitting there on 7 big blinds, I'm going to find an excuse to push with an awful lot of cards. I mean, I try to look at the Nash fold equilibrium charts and push as close to that as I can. And if you're on the button with 7 big blinds, that's probably in the push fold range or pretty close.
That's in the is it in the jam range in the Nash 9-4 offers?
It's got to be close.
I bet it is close too. God, that's so hard to do though.
But the way I think about it this way is I believe in the concept of expected value, but I think it needs to layer on utility theory, which is a whole other discussion at some point. But from a pure expected value perspective, let's say you think you'll get fold even only 30% of the time, and 70% of the time you're going to get called. Well, on that 70%
equity if you're live.
Yeah, let's say you got 30% equity. That means your expected value is 30% of the time you just win it outright, and then there's another 21%, 70% times 30%. So really, you have a positive, expected value there that you're gonna win that pot 51% of the time. It's marginal, but you put yourself in the spot where you only have 7 big blinds. But now this is where the player dependency comes in. The idea of fold equity, like you said, if you think there's only a 10% chance that they're going to fold, well, now you have very little, fold equity is 10% and you have very little hand equity. But if you think it's 90% that they're going to fold, then it's every single time. So I think that's, as you mentioned, the player dependency thing. At 7 big blinds, you don't have a lot of options. I would be willing to fold that there if I'm in the button, thinking, well, the next hand I'm going to cut off and I'm going to hope I've got something better than 9-4.
Well, exactly. You're going to have 2 or 3 more hands, and I feel like that's the part that kind of can become dicey because you got 2 or 3 more to choose from, and are you not going to get better than 9-4 off?
Well, you do and you don't, though. See, that's the thing is you do if
someone might open
if it gets folded around to you. But that's the thing. That's where the opportunity comes in. Is you wait 2 or 3 more hands, but you're betting on it's going to be folded around to you. Well, especially if you're playing the tournaments that we're talking about, where it's a quote-unquote shove fest, what are the odds that it's going to get folded to you in late position more than once? So I think that's, to me, where, I maybe would be willing to fold it if it's a really sort of a tight table, maybe on the bubble, where I think there's a chance it'll get folded to me again with something better. But at the end of the day, this is such a great opportunity that you only have 2 people behind you and you still have some fold equity with 7 big blinds, because it's one of the advantages of being in a tournament where the average stack is 10 or 15 big blinds. That might be half of people's stack. So it's going to, it actually creates some fold equity there.
Well, and if you win this and take down the big blinds, now you're giving yourself another full round of opportunities
Fair.
to
You can find
find a
another
good
hand.
spot.
That's fair.
Or you now have 10 big blinds. Now you can shove over a raise if you either have a decent hand, or if it's a really loose person with a big stack or a medium stack or something. You actually now, when somebody opens to 2.5 bigs, you can shove 10. You actually have another play that's in your holster.
Well, and if you get doubled up from
Good
10,
point.
you're going to 20 big blinds instead of 14. And there's a big difference between 20 big blinds and 14.
Yeah, it's super interesting point. It's tough though. We're sitting there when you look at the 9-4 off, going, "Am I really going to jam this?" But I completely understand what you're saying. I think it comes back to the thing we talked about earlier. Like, can you do it?
And one thing I was going to say about that, I think kind of the point of that sentence. I mean, if that whole paragraph is interesting because he talks about lots of different options, but I think the point of that is you're down to 7 big blinds. You're in a situation that you may not get, like Steve, like you said, you may not get in that situation where everybody's folded to you. You're on the blind. That's a situation where you just have to take the risk in order to continue on in the tournament. And I think that's what he's saying is that, if you had to choose between waiting and maybe you're never going to have another situation and, you're gambling a little bit, but it's probably the right place to gamble.
Well, it's a good spot. Like we talked
You
about
got
earlier,
you got 7
that's a
big blinds.
spot.
It's not, you're not going to, you're really at the end of the amount of chips that you can theoretically come back from.
Yeah, Rob, I think I love what you said. That's a good spot. So, if you pick up 9-4 there, you pick up 9-4 there and you fold it, you're going to tell your buddies you're card dead, but you weren't spot dead. You had a spot. You had a spot handed to you on a silver platter.
That's such a good point. That's a super good. I hope a lot of people can learn from that. That's because I know I do. I never really thought of that way. It's super interesting. I think that's an excellent consideration. That's your spot. Like when you're driving home, you go, "Oh God, I had 9-4 when it mattered most." Nope, you had a spot and you.
Yeah, I agree with you guys, but to anyone listening to this podcast, when I have 7 big blinds, I only push with aces every time.
Liar.
You'll always hear me at the table saying, "I'm just sitting there waiting for aces."
Well, any other thoughts that people wanted to raise from the last few chapters of the book that we didn't get a chance to talk about? I know there's a lot there with short and medium stack, but anything kind of burning to throw out there?
I liked his general principle that as your stack gets shorter, you have to start to play tighter. And that doesn't mean not play aggressively, but it means, you can't speculate quite as much. You got to tighten up a little bit, maybe push more instead of just raising, particularly as your stack gets even smaller. So I always think that's a good trend to follow. You have to play tighter and also more aggressively.
On my sheet, I just had these couple. Any of this spawns the conversation, great. But you mentioned it, John, too. Tighten up the stack, get shorter. And I feel like what I got, I just wrote this down. I wrote pot control, pot control, pot control, pot control. Like he just hammers home pot control. And it's an interesting a concept from this book that I've taken a lot from that pot control part. But in 11, he had don't put a lot of chips in and then fold. Like you have to avoid this, but how you can avoid this is by pot control. So back to pot control, great. And I think we talked about the all-in squeeze. It's super powerful with the action in front of you, especially from the blinds or from some of the out of position places. Those are huge. And I did think that, and we don't have to discuss this, but I thought in 13 when he said, anytime that you can create a situation where you only need 30% to win when calling it all in, assuming you have you have a larger stacking of the player, that you have, like he had it in capitals, you have to call. And I thought there was a few scenarios in there where I was a little like, I guess I might have struggled from being a bit more of a type player where I'm like, I don't know, when I feel like maybe I'm like significantly beat, that's hard for me. But he literally wrote half in large caps. So that was one that I was interested to see what people kind of thought about that. But
And that was when he has enough chips, right? He has a pretty big stack to call.
Matt, yeah. I guess I shouldn't say it's Matt, but he had a larger stack than me. I don't know that he denoted how much more, but I get that, but it's hard sometimes to put that in jeopardy, you know.
Well, it's one of those concepts that I really do want to explore at some point. I'm actually researching it myself because I think there's the notion of expected value, which I think is a proper notion in a cash game. And then with tournaments, you layer on this element of survival. And so it's more like a curve rather than this linear expected value if you're thinking about it graphically.
Yeah, with ICM, it's different.
Yeah, ICM or utility theory, or I've got all kinds of names for it. But I think the principle from a mathematical, geometrical perspective is if you have enough chips, the marginal value of those chips becomes kind of this linear type of function. And I'm sorry I'm nerding this up a little bit, but I do think I think when you have a deep enough stack, whatever deep enough is, I think it becomes more of an expected value type of decision. And so in that case, if you feel like you have 30% equity, or if you only need 30% equity, you're going to have that against a range of almost any range. And so that's where it is the right expected value to call, because you're in sort of that linear portion of your value graph. But if you're down to a shorter stack, now you do have to account for things like survival and kind of this non-linear value of chips. And so if I'm thinking about the question correctly, I think if you have a deep enough stack, then I think you think about it from a pure expected value linear sort of thing. And I agree with him there, but it doesn't apply if you're a medium or shorter stack.
It also depends a little bit on what the table is like. If you're at a table where it often will go all the way around and maybe just be the blinds, but whenever anyone does push, they're always folding, then that's a spot where calling someone's all in isn't necessary, because you're going to get plenty of opportunities to add to your stack later. Whereas if it's a spot where it's always being opened and you don't have a spot to open push or to raise here or there, you kind of have to call. And there is a side benefit if you still have chips. If you show that you're willing to call someone's all in, they might tighten up and not push quite as often into you.
That's a genius comment.
I wouldn't go that far.
I'm not calling you a genius. I'm just saying the comment.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm sure it was from Jonathan. So then, yeah, you can attribute that to him.
I think I read that in Antia Magazine had an article by John Somsky. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack has the best poker room in Minnesota, featuring 24/7 promos on all cash poker games, including earning $2 per hour in comps, plus the most player-friendly tourney structures. Visit runaces.com for daily promotions and the tournament calendar. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack, the official sponsor of Rec Poker. All right, well, that's it for this edition of the Rec Poker Podcast. A reminder that next week we're moving to our new format where we'll look at a specific question and get feedback from several top players. I think it's going to be very insightful. I think you're really going to enjoy that. As always, you can find us on Twitter at Rec Poker, Facebook group Rec Poker. You can email me directly, stevefredland@gmail.com. Gotten a lot of great emails, had a lot of great email dialogues about hands and that sort of thing. I enjoy that a lot. But if you have a content idea, feel free to send that along as well. You can always listen to us, this one and past episodes, at runaces.com/recpoker. That's a great, easy way to pick up the podcast. All right, that's it. Take care, y'all.